Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining me on my stress series. And today we're going to be talking about stress and genetics. And I've actually titled this one, Were You Born with a Stress Gene? So that's the goal for today, and I'm going to go over actually 3 points today. So how does stress affect your DNA or your genetics? That's point number 1. Number 2, is there actually a stress gene there? And then number 3, what can you do about it? Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about. And before we get started, let me introduce myself again. So my name is Dr. Jeffrey Lee, and I'm both a naturopathic doctor as well as a registered acupuncturist. And I've been in practice for 15 years in Richmond, British Columbia. And especially the past few years, I've just been fascinated in studying the brain. So I've been taking a lot of courses on neuroscience and just understanding the brain. And so I've been working with the Carrick Institute down in Florida. And the past few years has been an awesome journey. I've learned a ton, but it's also very complex with when we're talking about brain. And now that I'm kind of talking a little bit about brain, genetics, and stress, I'm going to try to simplify it as much as I can. So please interact with me if you have specific questions. I'm going to take some time to look at the comments there. And if something is not clear, please write that in the comments there. Okay, now before I launch into those 3 topics or those 3 points, I just want to let everyone know that finally my stress quiz is online. So if you are, patients are Bray, you probably got an email. If you're not, you're totally welcome to. I encourage you to share this link with everyone. And so it's called howstressedareyou.com. I try to keep it as simple as possible. So howstressedareyou.com. And I really invite you to take that quiz. I've done my best to sort of categorize things to sort of give you just a very quick kind of summary of where you might be on this stress pyramid. And I've also provided some just awesome PDFs just to help you kind of take control of the stress in your life. So I spent a lot of energy working on those, and I hope that can help you and help some of your friends out there. Okay, so I want to start off by, I guess when I was preparing for this talk, the first thing that came to my mind is maybe a myth that I always hear people say. So is stress the same for everyone? And my answer is no, we don't all experience stress the same way. It's definitely different for everyone. And I was just thinking about preparing for like a Facebook Live or just public speaking. Like there's some people that really thrive in this environment and they just love being kind of in front of a screen talking to people. And then there's also the other extreme where people that they're deathly scared of that. It's not my favorite thing, but it's something that I'm learning to enjoy to do. But you can really see that some people really thrive and it's not stressful at all, while other people it's incredibly stressful. So right there we already know that there's a big difference. Stress is definitely not the same for everyone. And how does that impact us on the inside? So my point number 1 is, how does stress actually affect our genetics, right? Now, and please let me know if that's actually like a relevant question for you. But I think there's a point that I really want to make there, that chronic stress does impact our genetics there. And I'll explain in a moment. But I just want to give you a bit of a background. And my goal for today is to hopefully give you enough foundational information on genetics and stress that you could make some positive changes in your life, but also maybe spur on more questions there. And I'm definitely happy to answer more. So the question is, the background is, what are the genes or genetics there? A couple of things to keep in mind. So our genetics, it's that blueprint for our cells. It's that code, and it's stored in the strands of our DNA. So every single cell in our body has this genetic information. So every single cell in the body has that information that we can produce cells or produce our own unique genetic makeup, and it's actually brilliant. So the important thing to remember is the DNA, it's a sequence of codes, and what our body does is it takes that code and it produces proteins. So our body is this amazing protein generating factory. We produce all these proteins there. And these proteins, it really dictates how our body is to function. And any tiny modification to our DNA tells our proteins to be, produced slightly differently. And so I'll come back to that concept, but I just wanted, the take-home message for this is it's our genetic blueprint. That's what our genes are. It just gives us all the codes there. And I want to tie it back into how chronic stress kind of affects our DNA. Now, in going back to like grade 11 biology, cells, they divide. And the genetic material goes from one cell to the other. And as our genetic material is dividing, there are strands at the bottom after they divide. These strands, they're called telomeres. And at the very end of it, just think of a telomere as kind of on a shoelace, that cap that we have on our shoelace. And sometimes when you don't have that cap there, your shoelace starts kind of unraveling. And that's the problem when there's too much chronic stress. So what chronic stress does is, remember that cortisol that we talked about last week? Cortisol is that stress hormone. When there's too much chronic stress, too much cortisol, what that does is it impacts the ability for us to repair those ends. And when we can't repair those ends, the strands start unraveling very easily. And in fact, every time our cells replicate, the strands get shorter and shorter. And so that's a problem with chronic stress, because if we didn't have that chronic stress, our body has an ability to produce this enzyme or this protein to repair that cap. So when the cells divide, it gets repaired, and then the cell division can continue. But I'm going to say it a bit differently. When we have too much stress, cortisol impacts the ability for us to repair those ends. And what that happens is it causes either premature cell death, so our cells simply die, or it gets into a pro-inflammatory state. And that's one of the things that I was talking about last week, about how cortisol really causes a lot more inflammation, and it impacts our immunity, but it also impacts our genetics there. Okay, so that's a classic understanding of how chronic stress can impact our genetics there. Now I'm going to move on now to point number 2. Before I move on, are there any questions about this? And again, feel free to just jump in, have some questions there. So I want to talk about now point number 2 is there actually a stress gene? And you kind of hear that, I've read different articles about that. Some people are saying there's a definitive stress gene, but there actually isn't. There isn't one gene that is linked to, causing more stress. So the take-home message in this section is stress is that combination of our genetics, so how resilient we are, and I'll get to that in a moment. It's a combination of how resilient we are and our environment. And I'm going to explain it this way. You've probably seen that there are some people with we have different genetic profiles. And some people might be more of a warrior genetic profile. And then the other end extreme is a worrier, somebody that worries all the time, that's stressed out all the time, versus the warrior, kind of ready for battle. And you actually, when you study their genetic profiles, it's actually quite different. Where, going back to what I said earlier about somebody that thrives in a public speaking type of environment there, or in a very social, that's more of a warrior type of a genetic profile, where they welcome the stress. They can handle that adrenaline load. They're okay under higher cortisol. Versus the worrier. Another definition is a worrier is a person that thinks a lot, that strategizes a lot. And for them to be at their optimal, they need to be in a calm, kind of more of a relaxed environment. So where are you? That's something that it's important to get to know yourself, understand your tendencies, your personalities, because we're also uniquely different. And I think that's really important to really get a hold of stress and really map out, are you a person that certain things just really stress you out? But I also want to make the distinction right now that please understand that not all stress is bad, and in fact, having some of that good stress in our life is really important to just stimulate us to make some positive changes in life. Okay, now I'm going to continue this thought about the stress gene question. I want to touch on this concept called epigenetics there. So epigenetics simply means sort of an outside modification of our genetics there. And I mentioned to this last week that our genetics are actually, things like our skin color, our hair color, eye color, like those don't change. But there's parts of our genetics that can be influenced by our surroundings. And the classic example I like to explain to my patients about epigenetics is this. So I come from a family that has a lot of diabetes. So type 2 diabetes is actually quite rampant in my family. So both my grandmother, my mom, they all have type 2 diabetes. Now, when I was around 18 or 19 years old, I was actually quite overweight. I was about 50 pounds heavier than I am right now. And when I was, starting to test my blood sugar around that, just doing checkups, I started seeing that it started creeping up. And so my doctor at that time says, Jeff, you got to watch out for your blood sugar levels because of your family history. Now, at that point, I thought I was doomed. I thought that I was going to get type 2 diabetes. Now, however, I just did a couple of years ago, we did some more blood testing for insurance purposes, and my blood sugar is perfectly good. My hemoglobin A1C is perfectly fine. And so why I'm explaining it that way is because epigenetics means that I was able to turn off that diabetic gene. Now, I still inherited it. I still have it in my body. It's coded in my DNA. But my lifestyle, my environment, my healthier diet, my exercise, all that, I've turned off that switch. I've turned off that gene. And that's incredibly powerful. And I hope that's actually very encouraging, very exciting, because I think some of you might be watching right now, and let's bring it back to stress. I think some of the patients that I work with that are just overwhelmed, that are just burnt out, they feel like this is nonstop, and they can't imagine that they can recover from this. I just really want to encourage you, because I have seen it with hundreds of my patients, and even for myself, just when I'm under a tremendous amount of stress load, I know that there's ways that I can do by changing my environment. And environment could be nutrition, exercise, building in good habits and routines in my life, and that has really transformed my stress there. So I just wanted to summarize this point is environment makes a difference there. Now, I want to go into a little bit more detail in point 3, but okay, I see a couple of questions here. Thank you. I feel that when I was younger, I was a worrier. Last few years, a worrier. Can it change? Excellent question. That's actually a very fantastic question. And I want to tie it back into what I was just talking about as well, because naturally, as we age, there's going to be changes, right? There's going to be changes in our kind of resilience and our tolerance there. However, I also believe that as we age, we do, we don't get out there as much as we used to in terms of, exercise. Sometimes our body actually needs a lot more routine, or it needs a little bit more structure, and we're a bit resistant to that. So I just wanted to, in my next section, I'm going to talk about this particular protein that you can stimulate in your body that actually can probably reset your system. So I hope that kind of answers your question, because the answer is yes, it can change, but also at the same time, we have sort of this tendency, right? We have this sort of genetic blueprint that that's usually our kind of default mode there. We can positively change that for sure, and that's through habits and lifestyle. But when we're seeing these kind of fluctuations, I do believe a lot of it is kind of that maybe that season that you are in life there. I'm going to answer the next question there. When we talk about chronic stress, are we talking years or decades? Good question. So what is long-term chronic stress for people? I love that question, because it really does vary from individual to individual. And we all have a different amount of tolerance, but usually when I talk about chronic stress, it's usually when you have it for long enough that you are really noticing physical symptoms, physical changes there. And for some of my patients, even within a few days, I can really dramatically see them kind of get stuck in this rut. But usually when I'm working with my patients, I really see sort of the long-term damage of chronic stress, especially if it's affecting things like, the genetics and the telomeres there. This is when we're talking about ongoing stress for usually years. Now, I think, yeah, that's an excellent question. I hope I was able to do justice to it, because everyone's a bit different in terms of their tolerance and their resilience there. And I hope that next section kind of answers that and makes sense there. Let me see. The question, if a parent turns off a gene before having kids, will it be passed down? Oh, excellent. Very excellent technical question there. So how I'm going to answer this one is by turning on or off the genes, it doesn't permanently recode the genetic structure. And I'm going to be very careful how I explain this, because the concept of epigenetics is that influence on the genes. And our genes, sometimes when we're replicating our genes, they're not perfect copies of one another. There's little kind of coding errors there. And I want to make a point that I'm just trying to think the best way to answer it, because this research is actually changing. So to my present knowledge right now, epigenetics, our environment, we can actually change how our gene produces that protein, so how it affects us right now. Now, does it change the DNA so then when we pass it on to our next generation? This is a very hotly debated topic there. And I'll touch on it because I want to, because to me it's very fascinating, because there's a lot of, when I first learned genetics, so this is back at University of British Columbia, 20 plus years ago, we didn't learn it this way. But now, all the recent conferences that I've been going to, especially the past 4 or 5 years, we're finding that our understanding of sciences, when we've learned it from kind of the cellular way of understanding genetics, that's not fully correct, because there's also this incredible quantum way of understanding our genetics. Quantum is around like a lot of energy. And so are there memories or things that can be passed on from one generation to the other? If you asked me 20 years ago, for sure not. But if you're asking me now, it's quite fascinating what they're discovering in research. They're discovering certain things that might even skip a generation, or certain things that are passed down. Now, I hope that answers your question, and maybe let me just read it again real quick to make sure so if a parent turns off the gene before having kids, will it still be passed down? The simple answer is we don't know fully, but the impact of your own epigenetics, the changes that you experience there may not always be passed on to the next generation. I hope that answers that question there. Now, I want to go back to my point number 3. I want to talk about something called Brain-Derived Neurotropic Factor, BDNF. And BDNF is a protein that is really your kind of tolerance to stress and your resilience type of protein there. And what BDNF does to the brain is actually it stimulates your neurons. It actually helps kind of preserve the neurons. It helps your neurons. So neurons are brain cells. It helps your brain cells grow and adapt. So it's a very powerful protein there. And it also enhances kind of communication in the brain. So bottom line, BDNF is very important at improving resilience to stress there. Now, I'm going to tell you a quick story, because I learned about BDNF, let's say 5-6 years ago, and I was sitting in a lecture hall, and I was next to a colleague there, and I was we were analyzing our own genetic profile, and it turns out that my natural production of BDNF is actually incredibly low. And they started like teaching us, when you have lower BDNF, there's these issues, you're prone to nervous breakdown. Actually, that seminar was a really interesting one, because I found out that I have a lot of these other imbalances in my serotonin production or my dopamine production. So at the end of that, I was feeling pretty down with myself. But I get a sharp nudge from my colleague. They're like, you finished like a master's program, a doctorate program, a science degree. What are you all worried about? So I think that's also when she kind of snapped me back into reality. I realized that yes, so BDNF is a very important protein. But at the same time, in my lifestyle, I've done a lot of things where I have a very good diet. I exercise a lot. I have sort of quiet time, a prayer time every morning. I do my journaling. A lot of that is building these good practices in my life that has really kind of sustained this sharp brain, if you were to call it, because I've got a lot that I process, right? Whether it's through teaching or doing research there, I've got to keep my brain pretty sharp, and I can really tell that if I'm overwhelmed and stressed, my sharpness really comes down. So the next question is, so how do I boost my BDNF? And I want to conclude with this, because brain-derived neurotropic factor, it's important to kind of assess where you are at, and I've told you that mine's a little bit on the lower side. So what I've been very intentional at doing is my exercise, because science shows that high intensity exercise, and high intensity could be just a short duration. So something that I'm doing is with my kids and my family is I'm just doing like a 4-minute high intensity vigorous workout 3 times a day. Okay, so I'm just doing that, or at least a couple of times a day a week I'll go on my bike. And my bike, I'll go for a slightly longer ride, but in between, I'll do a short burst of a 30-second, as hard as I can. I'm riding as fast as I can, and then I slow down for a few minutes there. That short burst of energy and intensity has shown that your muscles can release a large amount of BDNF. So the body is so well designed that when we release that BDNF, it's incredibly supportive for that brain there. So I want to leave you with that, because this is something that I've, in the past few years, especially some of my patients who've gone through some, a lot of overwhelm, they're under a lot of stress. They know that exercise is really important, but when I break it down and explain to them how it actually works, how exercise, especially intensity, releases BDNF, and actually, if you can do that regularly, that is actually going to support that brain and help you become so much more resilient to stress. Now, I hope that was helpful. So just a quick summary there. My point number one was chronic stress damages the telomeres. Point number 2 is we all have this unique genetic profile, and our environment can really influence our epigenetics there. And then number 3, I talked about BDNF, and BDNF exercise can definitely boost it for you. So I hope that was helpful for you. I'm just going to see, are there any questions? If you have any questions, please feel free. And while I'm waiting for some questions, I just want to give you a sort of an update. This coming Thursday, so in a few days from now, I'm going to be talking about stress, anxiety, and I'm going to mix in some panic attack as well, the topic on that. And I'm going to try to research it a little bit on a Chinese medicine perspective and share with you there, because it's quite interesting how Chinese medicine looks at panic attacks there and anxiety. So we'll talk more about that on Thursday, so I invite you to join me. And also, just a reminder, just jump onto that stress quiz. I'm curious if any of you have done that already. You can let me know where you guys landed on that quiz. So again, the URL is howstressedareyou.com. And yeah, you're very welcome. I'm glad that was helpful for you. Happy to serve everyone here. And if any of you, watching this a little bit later, have certain questions, please go ahead and comment or even email me, and I'll do my best to. Well, I'm trying to get better at checking Facebook a little bit more often, so hopefully I'll get that to you. So it looks like there isn't any more questions. Have a wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.